when you ask people about the word bee, many images will come to their mind. One might think of, ouch, it's going to sting. Another might be the National Spelling Bee. Is it a competition? And then, of course, another one might be thinking of that wonderful spread that we put on our charcuterie board, or even simply on a piece of toast. Today's guest is a renowned and extremely well respected mead maker. And he's going to share with us the state of mead and fascinating facts about it. So welcome to the show, Alexander Eckert. It's wonderful to have you with us.
It's a pleasure of mine. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure. So, Alexander, when we mention the term honeymoon, and many would know what we're referring to, the honey relates to the ancient drink made from honey, and there should be enough for the newlywed couple to last at least till the new moon. And that's how the origin of the word honeymoon came about. Now, that ancient drink is made from honey, and it's called mead. So what is mead exactly, and how is it made?
Well, mead is the oldest alcoholic beverage mankind has discovered. It's mainly just fermented honey water.
Okay, so if one was to, get the honeycomb, would they technically be able to make it? How do you, actually make it? What's the process you go through?
More or less, it is very simple. You do have honey, and if you have raw natural honey, there is pollen in it, and within the pollen you got yeast colonies, and in the natural state of honey, the yeast is deactivated because it contains too much sugar. So if you water the honey down, the yeast will start to be alive again and start to eat the sugar and change the sugar into alcohol. And therefore, mead will be exist.
So it's a normal fermentation process then?
Indeed. Mead is very similar to wine, grape wine. Instead of grape juice, it's just honey water, which is fermented.
Okay, so are you saying that pretty much anyone, if they get some honeycomb and they add water to it and they let it rest, it will naturally ferment?
Usually, yes. You don't know the outcome, of course, because there are many yeasts around, so it can maybe taste well or not so well, but it will usually start to ferment.
Now, you're originally from Germany, Stuttgart. How did you land up in Switzerland?
Well, because of the law. Stuttgart is very close to Switzerland, and I meet my former girlfriend in Basel, which is the biggest city in Switzerland close to Germany. We met there, and I fell in love, and that's where I decided to change the border.
Ah, I see. So that's what brought you to Switzerland. Now, getting back to that honey, technically, can any source of honey be used? And what's your preferred method and why?
So far, the kinds of honey I had fermented all went very well with the fermentation. I heard from other mead makers that there are some kinds of honey which won't be very easy to ferment, but usually you can use every kind of honey. The method I use is just a very simple one. It's an old ancient method which is called boiling. So
boiling.
You boil the honey under water. Or you had boiled in former times, Nowadays, I try to let the honey be healthy, so I don't boil it anymore. I just heat it up so it gets more liquid, add water, and stir it to get well diluted honey water. Yeah, then I insert yeast or I ferment spontaneous. It depends on the kind of meat, and just control the process.
So is it very you know, getting a little bit technical now? Is the temperature that you are going to sort of melt, you know, and liquefy the honey? Is it a slow sort of heat that you apply, or is it quite fast? You know, what's the proportion of water, and does that make a difference?
Indeed. I try to be around 40 degrees of Celsius.
Okay.
I don't know if you use Celsius in Canada or Fahrenheit. Honey should not be warmer than 40 degrees because of the vitamins which will spoil them if it get any hotter. So I try not to get hotter than 40 degrees. Yeah.
I see. Okay. And what's the proportion of water that you add?
Usually the kinds of meat I use, I make is 1 part of water, no, 1 part of honey and 2 parts of water. So there's rather a lot honey within the bottle of meat. But you can use, let's say, 1/5 of honey and 4 parts of water. This will work as well, but you don't taste the honey as much, of course.
Of course, because of the dilution. Right. So, you know, when you think of honey, you think it's sweet, but on your website, you know, apparently not all meat is sweet, and some meat is aged in oak barrels. I mean, like wine, you know, not all wine is sweet. Some are, some are not. Some are aged in barrels, some are not. Could you share with us the distinctive styles and types of mead?
Of course. No, it gets a bit broad.
Yes.
Because as meat is so old, there are so many styles of meat and so many different meats. Every culture around the world has more or less found meat and got its own style of meat. So we distinguish, how to say, kinds of meat in a very basic sortiment. So we first have the traditional meats. They're just made out of honey, yeast, and water. You have 3 different styles. That's sweet, semi-sweet, and dry. Then you have the melomels. These are meats which are fermented with fruit. So
with fruit,
yeah. You can, for example, piment is a meat which is fermented with grapes. You do have a cider. The cider is a mixture between a cider and a meat. So apples and honey, which are mixed together and fermented. For example, you do have cherries. So there's a really big
lot of variety.
Yes, a huge kind of variety. Of course, you do have spiced meats as well, where you use all spices like pepper, cardamom, pine tips, cinnamon, and so on. You do have coffee meal. There you ferment coffee with the honey. Capsicum meal is where you use chilies. So to work with the spiciness of the chilies and the sweetness of the honey, which is a real nice combination. You do have rodomels, that's rose hips and honey. And well, I can talk for hours because there's so many.
So what I'm picking up, Alexander, literally you could add anything. Now I'm quite curious. You say you can mix it with grapes. Now is that grape juice that you're going to mix it? So therefore you have some of that sugar in the grape juice, the mousse, that would also be fermenting then.
Yes, of course you have to set the amount of sugar right. So you can't use as much honey as in traditional meads with a piment mead, because then you will have too much sugar, and the fermentation will be not as easy as one. But of course, you can use the grape juice, or you can use the whole grape, the whole grapes. So
you can use the whole grape, so you don't even need to crush them. Is that what you're saying?
Of course, sorry. Of course, you crush them and well, like a wine, but added with honey.
Okay. Now, have you made many different varieties of mead with different varieties of grapes?
So far, I mainly produce traditionals because there's so many kinds of different honeys. I compare it like this, that every kind of honey is like a different kind of grape for me. So with each single kind of honey, I can make an own style of mead.
Right, because I was just thinking, if you were going to use, let's say, a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling or a Toronto's grape, because those are very, or Viognier, those are very aromatic. Would you get those smells and aromas coming from that honey that was mixed with those particular grapes? I've not had the pleasure yet. So
you would have. So far, I did once an experiment with an old kind of grape, which I fermented spontaneous. And I made a very light mead of it, which still sparkles like a pet nut, pétillant naturel. And you really can, you were able to sense the kind of grapes.
okay.
Also, a friend of mine once made piment with a Gewürztraminer, and it was really a pleasure to drink.
Okay, so you do get a little bit of the characteristics of the grape then when it's in with the mead. Very interesting. Now you're the president of the European Mead Makers Association. Tell us more about that association. When you say European, does that mean EU?
No, it's Europe, because Switzerland isn't in the European Union.
That's right. That's why my question. Yes.
And well, the European Mead Makers Association was founded in 2017, so it's a very young organization. Because I sense there's a growing market, and more meaderies are open here. And in the United States, there is the American Mead Makers Association, which was founded some years ago. So it's a bit much older than the European Mead Makers Association. And it's always good to work together, even if you're competing against each other, but we all work with our hearts, more or less. And,
yes.
so we can use our whole force to promote mead a bit bigger.
So how many members do you have, and do they come from all across Europe?
Indeed, they're mainly from the northwestern part of Europe. That means Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany. But also we got a huge amount of Polish meat makers because Poland has a very long tradition making meat. In former times, the climate was too cold in Poland to get grapes. So they were very known in Europe for making meat.
Hmm.
Yeah, for the members, at the moment, I know of 150 European meaderies. Unfortunately, they're not all within the European Mead Makers Association, because as we're really a young association, we are still promoting ourselves and get our meaderies into the boat.
That's very interesting. And, you know, talking about Europe, how much mead is actually produced in Europe and how much is from Switzerland? You know, when we think of wine, we think, oh, Italy, we think of France, we think of Spain, the big names, and we know pretty much how much is produced. But what about mead?
Unfortunately, there are no numbers yet.
Ah,
At the moment, there's a questionnaire going around Europe, and I hope it will be filled out soon. But so far, there are no numbers. What I can say actually is that there is a lot less produced than wine, because there are not there isn't so much honey around than grapes.
yes, it's a dwindling bee population.
Yeah,
So who would you say is the highest producer of mead in Europe?
it's Poland.
Poland, and who would come in second?
After Poland, I think maybe the Slovakia and Czechia, because they're also very historical known for traditional meats. Yeah, mainly the northeastern European countries.
All right. So interestingly enough, you know, when you make wine, you need grapes, and when you make mead, you need honey, but you need the person, the skilled personnel and staff to do that. So does the European Mead Association, of which you're the president, have a school or a training center to teach the next generation of mead makers?
Not yet. What we developed so far is a kind of score sheet, so we can judge different meads. And this was the first step to gather information and to be able to compare meads together. And afterwards, one big goal is to actually teach people how to really make good meads, to use the right kinds of honeys, because there are several industrial meads around which are not very nice, and people get to know them. And, the problem is, if people think about meat, they think it has to taste always the same. So if a customer wants gets I say a bad bottle of meat, there's always the danger that this bad bottle will be in his mind, and he will say, no, I don't like meat. I have drunk it once and I don't like it. And actually, if you speak in the wine world, no one will ever say this, because people know there's so much different kinds of wine. And it's the same with meat. So, yeah.
So we have the length and breadth of variety and differences. Now, you know, when we talk about wine, we say, oh, this wine is faulty. You know, it might have nail polish, or, you know, aroma, or it might have wet cardboard or vinegar. You mentioned the word bad mead a few minutes ago. what exactly, how would you identify bad meat from the aroma, from the smell when you tasting it and nosing it?
Well, actually, we do have the same faults like in wine, as you mentioned, with the cardboard or the horse smell, for example. But what I call a bad meat is a meat which is way too sweet. And the sweetness isn't from the honey, but from added sugar.
Added
So,
sugar.
yeah, unfortunately, you are allowed to back sweeten a meat. And here with the back sweetening, you can use all kinds of sugar. Of course, it depends on the country, but I know from Switzerland and from Germany, the laws allow you to add sugar. This, of course, is a bit cheaper than honey, but the taste is very different to a meat which is just made out of honey.
Of course, the sugar, the breakdown, the chemical breakdown of the actual sugar would, you know, the sweetness is quite different. So who governs the laws of what you can and cannot do when you're making meat in Europe? Is it country by country or?
Indeed. That's also a big, how to say, it's a big difficulty as a European Mead Makers Association to gather all the different meats under one carpet. But we try to work with our politicians as well to point them into the right direction.
So Alexander, this is interesting. It's called the European, right, association. Why not the EU? Because then surely if it's EU, you'd be able to enact, you know, the legal process, would you not?
Not as much because every country within the European Union still got its own laws. And concerning food and beverages, each country is very proud of its own style of food and beverages. So here the European Union hasn't as much as to tell the different countries.
Okay, so it appears that mead production is still in its infancy in terms of the legalities and how you can and how you label it. You know, talking about that label, with a wine, you know, if it's been aged for a longer period, you know, they might say, you know, reserva, or, you know, the different levels of quality, let's say of Italian wine, you know, DOCG. Is there such a thing in the labeling of mead? If someone picked up a bottle of mead, would it state, you know, for a person who's picking up a bottle, what should they look for?
It depends on the country, unfortunately. Poland, for example, is very advanced. Here you got different styles of mead, which are based on the amount of honey-water ratio. So people can see the label and know how much honey is used within the meat and how long the meat is aged. But for other countries, it's a bit different. In Switzerland, for example, it's only if there's written meat on the bottle, people just are sure that all the alcohol is fermented out of honey, and that there's only water, honey, and yeast, of course, and you're allowed to add some herbs, and that's a mead. So if I want to make a melomel, so mead with fruits, I am no longer allowed it to call it mead.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Now, they say all good things take time, and and time is costly. Now, making mead from the time of fermentation to aging in a steel tank and then an oak barrel is close to 2 years. Now, your mead is currently priced at around 27.50 Swiss francs. Is that correct? For about a 50 cl bottle, which is 500 ml. Now, if I was to take that standard bottle of 750 ml of wine, the mead would cost equivalent of about 41 euro. Now, would you not consider that a big obstacle for purchasers, younger people, if one wants to make mead more popular? Because the price point, it's a huge barrier, especially if you think of Europe, you can buy a good bottle of wine at, say, 10 euro.
Here we do have two problems, more or less. First, the biggest one is that for myself, I'm a Swiss company. I produce in Switzerland, and Switzerland is very expensive. So you can't transform my prices into, let's say, Germany or France, for example. Switzerland is a high-price island in Europe. Our minimum wage for unlearned worker is 25 francs per hour. So, yeah, you see.
Yes.
The other thing is the way I make mead is a traditional way of making mead. So I use a big amount of honey and I use thyme. So it can take about, let's say, 4 to 6 months for the mead to ferment. And after the fermentation, I let my mead age for at least half a year, mainly a year. So that's the time which comes into the account as well.
Yes, of course.
And but it is also possible to make a mead with less honey and less alcohol within 3 weeks. These are so-called session meads. They're very light, and you can compare it to beer if you want to. Mm-hmm. Especially in the summer, they're very nice to drink. It's a refreshing kind of drink. And of course, you can drink a bit more with 7% of alcohol than with, let's say, 12 or 14%.
So, you mentioned Poland is the largest mead producer. How much do they charge for an equivalent of, say, 500 ml?
Compared to the, let me see the word. Compared to the amount people earn in Poland, it is rather expensive. I can't tell you the numbers because I don't have.
So they'll vary according to country, according to production.
The thing is, just mead, if you think about it, has to be the most expensive kind of beverage because you use honey to make it. Barley and beer and hops or grape wines way more easy to produce and therefore cheaper than honey.
Okay.
And that's the reason also mead almost vanished from the world. So people know wine, people know beer, but mead, most people have a big question mark in their faces if you tell them about mead.
Right. Talking about that, there's two big topics on everyone's lips when it comes to food security. That's climate change and organic. So how is climate change and the adding pollution affecting the bee colonies?
What I see is that from year to year, there is less honey, unfortunately. Of course, bees collect all the nectar from around 3 kilometers around their hives, and they collect whatever they find. So bees can't tell whether if a crop is organic or a flower is organic or not, genetically modified or not. They just do what nature tells them. That's collect pollen and nectar.
Okay, so would you say pollution is affecting the population of the bees to a greater or lesser extent? And how about the sort of what, climate warming?
The one thing is the bees itself are affected, and the other thing is the honey and the whole system. So honey, wax, the pollen. That's why I use mainly honey from Eastern Europe, because there you got more natural, organic kinds of flowers and what to say, kind of farming.
Right, right. Now, talking about organic, you mentioned, on your site, almost all of your wines are organic, and you don't have big signs on the bottle. While many would take your word, on the website, but there are also those that don't, and that's in life. Unless it says organic, and they'll say, well, why don't you write it? Have you ever been challenged to this, and how do you respond?
Yes, there is a really tiny little writing on the backside of my bottle which tells that it is organic certified, and my number. Also, there's a big website which collects all the organic certified companies, and there you can see which product is organic certified. So if you really if you really don't trust me, you have to look on the site, and you see my meads. So
right. So they actually are labeled then, just not very loudly and broadly.
Yes, because my way of thinking is just that the organic production is the way it should be, and it more or less should be labeled that food or a beverage isn't processed and produced in a natural way.
Okay. Now you mentioned, bees, they roam about pollinating the flowers, the berries, and various other flora. How sure are you that they've not been in a field that has been subject to spraying? And would that prevent the organic label then on the Mead bottle?
As I told before, I can't, how to say, cannot see where the bees gathered their honey.
Yeah, of course.
So the honey itself can be polluted with pesticides and herbicides. By organic beekeeping, it's more or less meant how the bees are kept. So, for example, you feed the bees with organic certified sugar syrup after you're taking out the honey. The wax which the combs are built is proved that there aren't any toxic ingredients in the wax, because what's in the wax will sooner or later go into the honey.
Right.
It is prohibited to feed your bees antibiotics, for example, and well, it's not about the honey, it's about the bees.
It's about the bees. Okay. Now, when we talk about wines, and you'll excuse me here because wines is quite central to what we do. So I would say all wines are good, but there are great ones and less great ones, as many things in life. In your opinion, apart from your mead, of course, Alexander, which mead do you feel is the sort of pinnacle level? You know, like if you're saying French wine, it's a Grand Cru from Bordeaux. If it's Italian, you know, it could be that DOCG. What about mead?
Well, personally, I really like Polish wines because
Okay.
not wines, mead.
Polish mead. Yeah.
Sorry. Because well, maybe it's of the heritage. My family once came from Poland, and therefore I do like the Polish meats very, very much. But concerning about what is a good meat, there is, for example, the Mesa Cup in the US, or the Mead Madness Cup in Europe.
Mead Madness Cup.
Mead Madness Cup, yeah.
Okay, that's quite a name.
These are international mead competitions, and the meads are judged by experts of the field. And if a mead wins their medal, it has to be good. So if one wants to taste or wants to know what's good meat, I just advise to look after the competition winners and search for them, and you will not find it, or you will not have a bad meat or
okay.
and not as great meat as could be. Yeah.
Now, Alexander, what advice would you give potential mead tasters? Like you know, you come to a wine tasting, and you know they're going to have a mead tasting. Is there a special order? Is there a special method to taste the mead?
It's very like as in the world of wine. So you first look upon the color, you smell the mead, and afterwards taste it. After the taste, it's the aftertaste. So it's maybe one-to-one as in wine.
Okay.
What I can advise someone who never drunk mead before is to be a bit open. I hope you can follow me.
Sure, please carry on.
If you once tasted a meat which you didn't like, there's a high probability you will once find a meat which you will like, because there's so many kinds of different meats. So it's just don't stop after the first try and you didn't like it.
So we're very much on the same sort of parallel as wine tasting. Now, my second last question to you, talking about pairing, you know, you mentioned that mead, it can be sweet, semi-sweet, and dry. If it's dry, you know, what could you pair that dry mead with? What would you pair it with in terms of food?
Of course, it depends on the meat. For dry meats, I think of maybe meat with a strong flavor, because if I think about my meats, well, I don't produce dry meats because it's a very hard field to produce a dry meat which tastes after honey. And for me, meat has to taste after honey.
After honey. All right, so what would you, let's say semi-sweet, what would you pair that with? What's your favorite pairing?
For the semi-sweet, if one is very experimental friendly, I would advise to go with a venison game or lamb, or curry, for example, because
that's interesting. Yeah,
the spiciness of the curry fits very well with the sweetness of the honey. Also with the game, you do have a very strong taste of the meat.
Right.
Meat, and therefore the meat with a strong taste of honey fits well.
So, Alexander, where do you see the future of mead? in the next 10 years in Europe?
I hope, well, that is really my hope, that everyone knows what is meat and knows the differences between several kinds of meat. So that there isn't the way of thinking that all meats are the same. And it would be really a nice thing if you can buy meat next to beer or wine in a shop. At the moment, you will find meat only in special kind of shops. Slowly, the how to say, the craft beer shops are opening for meat, and also the shops which are specialized for natural wines found meat. So it's a growing market, and I really look forward for the next years.
So for our audience, if they wanted to find more information, is there a website for the European Mead Makers Association that they can go to? And
it is, it's euromead.com.
Okay, euromead.com. And they will be able to find some of the very insightful and useful and very intriguing information that you've shared with us today. Please comment, like, share, or subscribe to our videos.